that I know that God is in control, but I also know that Satan works really hard. Isn't that true? Because last night I finished things that went through some stuff on my computer, put my computer away. This morning when I got up, I had my computer on a little stand, and we also had an iron on that stand. The iron turned over and poured its water contents all over the computer. And so when I woke up to set up things for tonight's program, my computer was dead. We spent the rest of the day trying to do things to get the computer system working, including buying another computer, setting that computer completely up. Anyway, I'll make it short. 12 hours later, we're still using a system that's not where we would like to be. So you'll just have the opportunity to follow along with us as we do that and make that work. And we know, like we said, the point is God's in control, right? And so the message will still get across. We also realized that one of the things that we wanted to do was have some opportunities to understand this whole series. This whole series has one object, and that is to understand the character of Jesus Christ better and to draw closer to him. We're going to be covering lots of different topics in that process, and that's part of what we want to do. Tonight is on the eve of Armageddon, And we're thankful for the message that we have. President Biden warned a nuclear Armageddon. He warned that was a possibility, a battle that was ahead for us. The battle of Armageddon. I think about that and see Scripture actually talks about that. It's Revelation 16, verse 14. It says, "For they are spirits of demon, performing signs, which go out to the kings of the entire world, to gather them together for the war of the great day of God the Almighty." That battle that's taken place, and they gathered them together to the place which was called in the Hebrew Armageddon. Putting the words together, Armageddon, we'll come back to that in a little bit. The Battle of Armageddon is something that people predict about. In fact, our president, if you looked at the date on that, was October of last year, predicted a nuclear Armageddon. So we pause to say, is the world heading toward Armageddon? Is that really where are we just on the brink of that end time event? How do all the elements fit together for that? And what does it mean to us? The world seems sometimes to be spinning out of control. In fact, if you look on so many different axes, there are things that help us to realize there are problems in the world today. So why the fear of Armageddon? If you look, there are lots of things around that give us that reason to fear Armageddon. And haven't we all been through the COVID pandemic? Jonathan Abram, the HMS assistant professor of microbiology and infectious disease, said that I would argue there's probably no end in sight, at least for the near future, for SARS, COVID-V, to spike protein evolution. It's not quite picking up there. We will probably be playing this dance with additional variants for some time to come. This was said last year in November, that his prediction is that we're just going to see new strains of COVID. And as far as political unrest, as we mentioned opening up, Biden warned of the nuclear Armageddon. And you can see the political unrest around us. Russia possesses the total of 5,977 warheads as of December 16, the largest stockpile of nuclear warheads in the world. We look and say it's not just unrest there, but food insecurity. 2022 global report on the food crisis. There we go. Close to 193 million people were experiencing acute insecurity with food. They weren't sure where their next meal was coming from. 80% since 2016. That if you look at that, that's an increase of 80% of people feeling insecure about where their next meal is coming from. And financial crisis, you look around and say, it doesn't take much to recognize that we're close to a financial crisis, if not there today. January 16, 2023, the World Bank had predicted the global recession for 2023, anticipating gross domestic products growth of 1.7%. That's the lowest pace since 1993. The financial crisis that we face, the World Bank estimates that at the end of 2022, 8.5% of the world's population will be in extreme poverty. It skips occasionally here. Financial crisis, currently 62% of the global population lives on less than $10 a day. They don't live in Sonora, right? I looked at some of the national averages. Doesn't like that slide very well. I looked at some of the national averages on consumer debt. And as you look over the whole picture of consumer debt and how it's working, you realize that it's one thing to talk about the debt of America, but let's talk about each family's debt. The average American credit card balance is $5,221. That's not in the positive. The average American car loan balance is $21,000. The average American personal loan amount owed is slightly over $17,000. So if you total those all together, it comes to $43,000. Climate change is another area that we're looking at today. International Plant Protection Conservation ends up talking about what's going on in our world today as far as climate change is predicted. If global warming reaches 1.5 Celsius in the near term of 21 through 40, it would cause unavoidable increases in multiple climate hazards and multiple risks to the ecosystem and to humans. There's natural disasters going all around us, and we see them here often more than other places. But sometimes if you would pull back and get a global view of what's going on, you'd realize that there are things happening. Flooding and landslides, 192 killed, according to the Times of India. In September 25, 2022, flooding and landslides killed at least 192. In August 25, at least 185 people have been killed and hundreds more injured during a month of heavy floods in Afghanistan. So when you start looking at these amounts, the numbers of people who have died, the issues that are there, natural disasters, many driven by the climate crisis, caused global economic losses of $313 billion in 2022. All around us, we see the devastation that's taking place. Mental health is another area where we're looking and saying, if you're looking at why we might have people considering that we're in a world that's falling apart, mental health is part of that. According to a scientific brief from the WHO, 25% of increase in anxiety and depression worldwide causes financial, the causes for that include social isolation, fear, sickness, grief, and financial anxieties. Healthcare. French researchers published a study in Lancet Oncology reporting that says the incident, I'll try to make sure and catch up here. There we go. The incident of cancer is expected to increase by more than 75% by the year 2030 in developing countries and over 90% in developing nations. Did you catch that? Cancer to increase 75% by 2030 in developing countries like ours. And 90% in not the developed countries, but the developing countries. That's an amazing statistic. And security crisis, according to a 2020 Global Rural Planning Services, They looked at cybersecurity failure as a critical short-term risk. And in 2022, malware and ransomware attacks went up by 358% and 435%. I start looking at the world around us and realize that there's an issue with moral decay as well. The recreational use of marijuana has now been legalized in 21 states. If you look at the moral decay, realize that they now have moved to a mature level of mature 17 plus, where it used to have a different area. We look at June 26, 2015, a landmark ruling that granted same-sex couples a constitutional right to marry. And that decision actually changed 14 states that did not previously allow that to take place, for them to have a federal mandate for that to happen. Moral decay is clear in 2023 statistics. Men admit to viewing pornography at least several times a week. In the 18 to 30-year-olds, 63% say they view pornography at least several times a week. And then if you look, it's not just for one group. Number of women who watch pornography videos or view explicit photos at least one time per week is 33%. I look at all those figures and say, is anyone in control? It seems like the world is on meltdown. Who is in control of the world? And then I stop and say, a bigger question is, who is in control of my world? Where I'm at, with the crisis that I'm going through. Has the world been out of control? Has it become that for me personally? Well, I can tell you it struck me personally during COVID when suddenly I went to Taco Bell and they were closed because they couldn't find employees. Crisis in my world. I mean, right? You all have your own things that it touches, and each of us are touched in different places by different ways. When it becomes personal, it's a whole different picture. I look at the lack of security that we have today, and many are saying, I don't have anything that I can count on. I can't count on the job. I can't count on help. I can't count on my family being able to be around. I can't even count on us being able to get together. I can't count on the financial security that I once had. It seems as if the world is falling apart, not just out there, but in my world as well. Sometimes family crisis is part of that, where love seems to be left and a wall being built between them. So much so that divorce is seeming to skyrocket and families breaking up seeming to increase. Those who are struggling with everyday license and what it means. But it's more than just the things that are there and the increase in that way. That's everyday kinds of things. This is a picture of Shelley's mother, and once we look at the death that takes place around us, it's a crisis to say, life shouldn't be like this. We've both lost our family, our parents, and during that time stepping back and saying, somebody needs to step in and take control. Do you wonder if anybody's listening to the cries of your heart? Enter an answer. A picture from the Bible. 705 BC. Daniel, who we've heard about before, was a youth, and during that time, a crisis took place for him. Prince Nebuchadnezzar blitzed through a military outpost at Carmel and then captured Jerusalem. Jerusalem, city of God. And if you would, in this scenario, you have Daniel who's serving God, and his God is just been conquered. At least from everything he sees. Imagine what it would be if you were praying and trusting in God and you had seen this deliverance come each time as God had delivered you, and then suddenly a foreign army came and you were praying and going through all the ritual, and suddenly you fell captive. Not just a small skirmish in a city, but the capital city. God's beloved city. Daniel's there working through, and if you would, Daniel reaches his personal Armageddon. His world is falling apart because it seems as if the God who had been in control is taken out of control. The question must have come in his mind, who is in control? Because their gods seem to be conquering the God. How do you deal with that? Actually, through the book of Daniel, there's coded messages that help us to look at times of crisis. Now, sometimes we've only looked at them from one vantage point. Tonight, we want to look at them a little differently. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams in his mind and was troubled as he could not sleep. And so the king summoned the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and astrologers to tell them what he had dreamed. Now, if you can imagine, these are the people, if you looked at their background, these are the people who studied all of the natural sciences, mathematics, astronomy. They even studied animals. In fact, they would open livers and cut them open and examine and give answers from the livers or throw oil on water. They came from multiple sciences and disciplines. They believed they controlled natural forces. And so here comes Nebuchadnezzar. By the way, if you noticed earlier, he was Prince Nebuchadnezzar. By now, he's King Nebuchadnezzar, because as soon as he took over Jerusalem, a message came from him, and he took captives back to Babylon because his father had died and he needed to take the throne. So he takes a lightning blitzkrieg back, and now he's setting up, and he has this vision. And he says, I want you to tell me the vision. And they say, you tell us the vision, and we'll give you the interpretation. How many of you could do that? Right? Come on now, you know you could. You interpret your wife's dreams all the time. Right? Honey, that thing that's chasing you was the pizza you ate last night. It was a little late. When you look at the controlled forces, the king wouldn't hear of that plan. And it was also because he couldn't remember the dream. The king replied to the astrologers, this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. That's crisis, if you want. A personal crisis. Daniel had first been grabbed as a youth, ripped into the courts, forced to serve, forced to study, and now he was at a place that the king was going to kill him. And I stop and I say, what do you do when things are out of control? When it's beyond your abilities? And Daniel went to the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And he urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven. Do you want to know what you do in times of crisis? Plead for mercy from the God of heaven. Now, it could have just said, pray, which is absolutely what they're doing, right? But I like these words because it's talking about urgent prayer. Throwing yourself open to God. That knocking on heaven's door until he opens. Help us to understand this mystery so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. He gets the picture. He understands what the king had seen. And now he comes into the presence of the king. Imagine it. Nobody else had been able to do it. And now Daniel had the whole vision and the interpretation. And he came to him. And this is the time where you get a chance to rise up in the ranks, right? Get your political standing. Just take a few steps up. The king asked Daniel, also called Belshazzar, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? You know what he's going to say? No. Now, let me come back to that. Can you interpret us? Can you tell me what that dream is? And he says, no. No wise man or enchanter or magician or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he asked about. The king says, "Are you able?" And he says, "Absolutely not." But there is a God. If you want to know the answer to the issues in your life in the midst of a struggle, when it seems like Armageddon is bursting on you personally, it's right there. There is a God. There is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, who has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. You have to pause and say, Daniel's amazing here because he won't take the credit upon himself. Your dream and your visions that pass through your mind as you lay on the bed are these. Who is in control of my world? He says, there is a God. And I'm not him, Daniel says. There's a God and I'm not in control. How many times do we think we're in control? Do we work to be in control? Do we go through all the motions to plan to be in control? He says, there is a God, and I'm not him. But his bigger message, and he's not you. I'm not him. There's a God, and I'm not him, and neither are you. Nebuchadnezzar, king of all Babylon, the one who's conquered, you're not God either. And then he tells the story. And I'm not going to spend a whole great deal of time on all the elements of the story. We're just going to kind of walk through it really quickly. You have the sheets that we gave you coming in that you can review the details. But I just want to start by saying he picks this statue up, and this statue is the image of a man, and it has layers of different metals on it. And it starts out with Babylon from 606 to 538 BC, and it says the head and the statue is made of pure gold. And he says, you are that head of gold. Now that must have made Nebuchadnezzar feel pretty good. Yeah. Babylon was called the Golden City. It was a fortress. It was impregnable. It was beautiful and laid out with 25 streets going from north and south. It was surrounded with its walls like a mighty fortress. It was beautiful in how it was laid out. Its wealth and structure were the marvel of the age. Such was the Golden City, the Golden Kingdom of the Golden Age. It was the magnificent, one of the seven wonders of the world. And he says, you're the king in charge of all of that. But there's going to be another king that comes after you. You know what that means? You're not going to be in control forever. You're not really God. And then he talks about Medo-Persia, 538 to 331, those crossed arms of the breastplate of the silver. And you know, silver is so important to understand because it's chest and arms of silver. After you, another kingdom will rise inferior to yours. Now, would you ever predict to somebody who's weaker, not as have as much military background, somebody else is going to come and conquer you? Is that the kind of prediction you would choose to make? In one fateful night, the Medes and the Persians stored the city by marching into the nearly dry beds of the Euphrates River and came and took it while the guards were drunk and took over Babylon in a moment's time without really even a battle, so to speak. And then Greece, 331 to 138. Its belly and thighs of bronze is this third kingdom. Alexander the Great in Babylon, in the battle of Arbela, conquered the Medes and the Persians. It took a great general only 5 years to gain the control of all the then known world. And then after him, Rome, 168 to 467. Its legs of iron finally said, there you will see that this kingdom is strong as iron. The armies of the republic, sometimes vanished in battle, always victorious in war, advanced with rapid steps, said Cardinal Gibbons. And the images of gold or silver or brass that might serve to represent the nations and their kings were successfully broken by the iron monarchy of Rome. If you would, this picture of the kingdoms one after another falling, it's amazing when you start thinking about how many kingdoms would you predict would come? And who would you say would come in each time frame? And this divided kingdom that's at the end of partly iron and partially of baked clay, Rome distinguished before the onslaughts of such nations as the alumni, the Germans, the French, and the Swiss, and a host of other nations. If you look at the pictures, even as the clay and iron will not cleave, so the Roman Empire has disintegrated and will never again become a united whole. I have to pause because the signs of the time, at the time that Hitler was moving to make a world kingdom, put on the front cover, Hitler will never form a world power, based on this prophecy. Pretty bold to put out there in the midst of war. But when we know that God has everything in control and not humans, it changes things. And I look at that whole picture, and that's awesome. If you look at it, it's a way to confirm that the Bible has an understanding of history. It's prophecy, it's accuracy on how many kingdoms would fall, and that greaters would fall to lessers, and the number of kingdoms that are there, even up to our current day. But that wasn't the message. That wasn't why the message was given. And it's something we can draw as a conclusion for today. And we've often spent all our time looking at history and taken that away as the message of Daniel 2. But that's not Daniel's message. His message comes with the stone that's cut without hands, and comes and crashes all those human kings that were once after another set up, and then it grows to be a mountain and takes over the entire world. It crushes the other kingdoms underneath it, and you find that as it shows the picture, it says human history is not the end of history. I'm pausing because I thought there might be an amen there. Human history is not the end of history. It's not that those kings are the ones who decided, but that rock represents the one who will come and ultimately build himself a kingdom that will never end. That's history. You know what that tells me? You know what it tells this king? You're not in control. God's in control. And he sets up kings and takes down kings at his will. And he was letting them know that because it was important too for Daniel to understand that these kings hadn't caught God off guard, that he was still in control. Your kingdom will not stand, he tells him, because you're not God. Who's in control of my world? There is a God. And he's not you. There is a God when things are changing. Now, I think for Daniel, he needed that message. There's a God when things are changing. Is our world changing? Is our world changing? Would have you ever predicted 5 years ago the things that have happened since then? That it could be that people were fighting over toilet paper? And that hand sanitizer would be a thing? And that we would be happy to find masks so we could go to the store? There is a God when things are changing. Then the king said to Daniel, Daniel 2:47, surely your God is the God of gods. Did you catch it? The king says to Daniel, he recognizes as the visions unfolded, surely your God is the God of God and the Lord of lords and the revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. God gives him a dream, and then he sends the interpretation to let him know he's God and he's in control and he knows what's happening. And again, there is a God, and Nebuchadnezzar, you're not him. For God has said, during the midst of our crisis, when things are changing, I will never leave you nor forsake you. I will never abandon you. Are you in the midst of Armageddon? Are you worried about the world being in Armageddon? Enemies capture Daniel and his friends and take them to Babylon. You can see how he would think that that's the end of things. But surprise, there's a God who lifts him up to be the top in the kingdom and be able to work with the king. Who's in control of my world? There's a God. He's not you. Things are changing. There's still a God when I am beyond me. I pause and say, when I am beyond me, safety consists not in the absence of danger, but in the presence of God. That's a takeaway. Safety consists not in the absence of danger, but being in the presence of God. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all the wise men. Daniel had moved from being a slave and jettisoned up to being over all of the wise men and been a witness to a foreign king. I pause to say, wouldn't you think that that was a miracle in itself for God to say, I'm going to send you and have a king use my experience with you to cause him to be converted? But it's hard sometimes to get beyond me. And it was hard for Nebuchadnezzar as well. When I'm beyond me, God can give me help. But you know what Nebuchadnezzar did? After a little while passed, and that often happens when we make those confessions to God, right? If you only get me out of this crisis, this little Armageddon of mine, then I promise I will, and you put in the rest of the blanks. Well, after it was over, Nebuchadnezzar evidently started thinking about those things and thought of himself as that head of gold and said, I don't like that picture. So you know what he did? He erected a statue that was solid gold. You get the message? There's not going to be another king after me. I'm going to be the king. I'm the one who's in charge. Everybody's going to bow down and recognize that my kingdom will last forever. All those who are my followers will be the ones who have this kingdom. It is going to be a dynasty and an empire forever. And that statue stood there to make that proclamation. And in order to make sure that everybody realized that he was the king, he had them all bow down and worship. Have you ever erected a little gold statue to yourself? If you have a question about it, ask your husband. Ask your wife. You ever erected a little gold statue to yourself? King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, the height of which was 6 cubits and its width 6 cubits. By the way, if sometime we get a chance to study the end time book and it mentions a number like 666, you find that 6 is a number of humanity. How are we doing out there? Because you'll find that in creation, that man was born on the 6th day. And so what happens is that becomes the number of humanity. And you know what he does? This human sets himself up above God and builds the statue of gold, the height of 60 cubits and 6. 66. The number of humanity who tries to take the place of God. Do you have your spiritual hearing aids on? Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? You hear the story? He's there, he calls for him, and there's a group of Hebrews who won't bow. Evidently, they had a different God than Nebuchadnezzar. Now, when you hear the sound of the horn and the flute and the zither and the lyre and the harp and the pipe, that had been quite a little orchestra, huh? And all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, You'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then, notice his words, what God will be able to rescue you from my hands? Do you hear the defiance? Who does he think really is God? Himself. What God? Where is there a God? He's saying, is there a God? I'm really in control. Daniel 3:16-18, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it is so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known, O king, that we're not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Do you hear what he's saying? Daniel says, they Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come together to say, listen, we know where we've already decided to serve, and that's the God of heaven. Not you, not this idol. So our plan is that whatever takes place, we're going to serve him, regardless of the consequence. Do you know how easy it is when you wonder if God is in control to doubt whether you want to serve God? Because you don't think he's producing in your life the answers that you want? How easy it would be to put yourself up in the place of being God. I find myself in that role. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are willing to go into the fiery furnace. They don't care because they want to serve God, and they don't need another chance to rethink their decision. He answers and said, lo, he throws him in, and we can go through great detail, but I want to get to the punchline. He answers and says, lo, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. Who's in control? Let's see. This king can't even burn up 3 guys. With all his armies and all his power and all his money, he can't kill 3 guys who defy him. I should say, he can't kill 3 guys and their God. There is a God. In the midst of my crisis, he's there. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command and yielding up their bodies as not to serve or worship any God except their own God. I pause to say I'm not sure how easy it would be to make some of the decisions they make. It takes faith, doesn't it? To say, the outcome doesn't seem to be the one I'd like. Like tonight, right? Going through, spending about 10 hours today working on trying to get the computers going and saying, God, you got to do something here. But the message is still being preached, right? There is a God. Therefore, Nebuchadnezzar makes a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks any offensive thing against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in their province. And the king looked over and thought he'd done an awesome job. And he was committed to God for a minute. Okay, maybe it was a little bit more than a minute. But you know how it works? What happens is he loses sight of that God being God, and he comes back to himself, and he goes up, and he's looking over, and multiple things happen, but at this point, he looks over and sees this incredible thing, and he says, is this not great Babylon, which I have built? Who's really God? God answers him. This is the first time you find a king on grass. Literally so. He goes through and eats like a beast and eats the grass up and takes it up. And here in the midst of all of this, he's not the great king that he thought he was. In fact, he loses his throne until God sets him back up again and allows him to be king. And he looks over his city and then he says, you'll be driven away from mankind. Your dwelling place will be the beasts of the field. You will be given grass to eat like cattle. And 7 years will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind. Who is in control? You see, his message to Daniel again and again and again to Daniel to give to Nebuchadnezzar is, there is a God. And he is in control. I look at his promise and it changes Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's section ends and he says, but at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was raised my eyes toward heaven and my reason returned to me and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion. I pause to say, remember that image? Remember how the king decided that he was going to be the one who lived forever and set up the golden image? Now he turns and says, he's the one whose dominion will endure forever, from generation to generation. Daniel said, let the name of God be blessed forever, and wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He who was in the darkness and light dwells in him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you have made known to me what you request of you, for you have made known. If you look at the picture, this king had now fallen before God. Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, praise be the name of God forever and forever. I look at the picture in the, we'll get there. One more. There we go. We look at the picture of the Battle of Armageddon. We started there. The Battle of Armageddon is a picture of what takes place at the end time and the events and the struggles of the end time. Revelation 16:14. I think my little clicker is a little tired. Revelation 16:14 says, and they gathered them together in the place which in the Hebrew is called Armageddon. Armageddon really means har meaning mount and Megiddo meaning of slaughter. It means mount of slaughter. There's actually no mountain called Armageddon or mountain called Megiddo. There's a valley of Megiddo, but no mountain of Megiddo. So why was this image put together? Because it means at the high point of slaughter, at the place where the places meet, the struggle meets, where that final battle will be fought. According to Scripture, Jesus Christ will lead a heavenly army to victory over God's enemies. And it goes through and talks about this battle. And if you listen, Revelation 16:15, and I saw the beasts and the kings of the earth and the armies gathered together and make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. If you want, this picture is not then just of a group in the final end. It's a battle between all those who belong to God and have made him king and those who haven't. It's a battle over that ultimate end when control will be taken, when God will come and set up his kingdom as the final kingdom. Thousands of years ago, a powerful angel named Lucifer was the one who now we call Satan, rebelled against God, and he gained a huge following. He had the same desire to make himself God, to set himself in control. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent called the devil and Satan, who deceived the whole nation and was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And when we look at that great battle, it's that battle that started way back then that is picked up at the end of Earth's time, because ultimately, when we look and say, Satan seems to be in control of this world, God says, no. In the end of all things, it's going to be clear. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. And he who sat on it was called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and wages war. His eyes are a flame of fire, and on his head are many crowns. And he has a name written on the crowns which no one knows except himself. His eyes are a flame of fire, and his head are many crowns, and he has the name written only himself knows. And the armies which are in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, were following him on the white horses. Out of his mouth came a sharp, two-edged sword to strike the nations. He will rule them with an iron rod, and he will himself tread out in the winepress the wine of his fury, of the wrath of God Almighty. And on his robe and on his thigh will be written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Armageddon will be a series of final battles at the end of the war. It will answer the question, who's in control in the struggle and the hardship we go through? And the answer is, there is a God. And that God, he'll raise up in this end time. When we look at the stories that we're going through, it will be looking at how we can have hope in God. God says that he's there and he's in control and he's with us through each struggle. You won't want to miss tomorrow night when we go through and talk about the God behind the scenes, as we look at the stories in Scripture that help us to realize that there's an invisible world that we often miss. And tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock, we'll be covering blood bought. And look at the picture of salvation from a relational standpoint. We have an opportunity through the next few days to take a deeper look at God and his picture for us. And I want you to just listen to this song as we contemplate